We seem to be fortuitous here that we're building on session after session, and we just had a bunch of city employees and their advocates in the business improvement area in Edmonton advocating for how government can be an enabler of everybody else to do what they need to do, and particularly business. So this session is all about business and all about the leadership that business can provide. And we have 4 important advocates for the business sector coming in from the Chambers of Commerce in Calgary, Montreal, Halifax and Toronto. So if I could ask Deborah and Michelle and Patrick and Jan to put their cameras on, and then we'll bring you into the screen here. And we've got a good chunk of time actually to talk specifically about what your chambers have been doing and what you see as the role of business going forward. You know, we did start, just FYI, we did start yesterday, and we did hear from business leaders, and we had various sectoral leaders coming in from commercial real estate and various components to talk about housing and transit and various things. But you're really our first session to talk with people that see themselves as the stewards of the economy and how we're going to contribute. You know, we're trying to make the case to the federal government. We're not trying, we are. We're making the case to the federal government that if you want the Canadian economy to recover, you need to be very serious and strategic and tactical about how you invest in downtowns and in the businesses and the commercial life that exists in downtowns. And I know this is the priority that each of you have been placing in your particular cities. And so we're really keen for you to talk with us. And then we have, as you know, hundreds on the line here who will ask all sorts of questions, which I'll feed into you as we go. The other thing I just want to remind people is that we are offering the summit in English and in French, en français. So if you prefer to hear in French, just go down to the bottom right there and click on the translation toggle and click the language in which you would like to receive the proceedings. You can hear in either English and French. And so Michelle, tu parles français if you prefer. You just choose whichever language. And if anybody else wants to, Deborah, I'd be dazzled if you want to speak in French. That'd be great. We're happy to have you. All right, we're happy to have you speak in whichever language you prefer. So I'm going to start, if I can, just by going around to each of you and asking you to give us a kind of picture of what the particular challenge is like that you've been experiencing and what the approaches you're taking. So I'm going to end, maybe one of you can talk at some point. I know, Patrick, you're the current chair. You can talk a little bit about the Canada Global Cities Council and your effort to stitch together this national narrative and coalition of commerce leaders like you folks, and why that was important for you to form it and how you see yourselves using that. We did have FCM on this morning, and I think all these intermediary organizations, networks that exist across the country are so critical to we're all making the same case, I think, that cities need to be treated differently, and they need to have particular kind of investment and policy leadership that empowers them, or as the session immediately prior to you, and allows them to enable the kind of life that we all want to live in the cities in which we've chosen to be. So, Deborah, I'm going to go to you first.
Sure.
And welcome to the summit, and keen to hear you. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and great to be here today. Obviously, Calgary is in a bit of a different situation than the rest of the major cities in Canada, because we started on our back foot when COVID hit. So we were already dealing with the fallout in the energy prices and what that meant. And so while we still paradoxically have the highest number of head offices per capita of any major city in Canada, you know, when we look at our vacancy rate in downtown Calgary, you'll have seen that it is 33% of the office towers in downtown Calgary are empty. And so what that means is we have a lack of vibrancy. We have businesses that have been compromised because they relied on that industrial model of a downtown that brought everybody in during the day and spit everybody else out at night. And really the foot traffic generated throughout the business day was what they relied on. So that's a huge problem. What it's translated into, of course, is a rising property tax burden for businesses outside the core because of the falling property values in downtown. There's an erosion of community vibrancy, financial sustainability. We've also seen community facilities like the Calgary YMCA, which is right downtown, right on the river, has been closed because of its lack of, it just wasn't financially viable to stay open. And so there's all these pieces that we're trying to figure out how to reclaim that vibrancy. And what do we need to change to bring people downtown? Of course, we are seeing a startup ecosystem that is starting to gain traction, which is great. The University of Calgary has been ranked one of the top 5 research universities in the country now as of this week. We're first in startups out of the university, so that means we're contributing to economic diversification and creating businesses. And we are the 3rd most diverse city in Canada, but it's still, the downtown remains very challenged, and we have to figure out what we do with those empty office towers. There are initiatives to convert them to living spaces, but there has to be more to it. It has to become a neighborhood that people want to live, work, and play, and have the services and amenities that are available to other people across the country. I would argue, we're behind Toronto, we're behind Montreal because we don't have that, let's say, post-secondary presence downtown that really adds to the vibrancy of a downtown core. So for us, it's how do we reinvest? How do we connect from a transit perspective? How do we revitalize? And how do we make sure that we have different pieces as part of our downtown that contribute to the vibrancy and take us away from that industrial model that we relied on for so long?
It's interesting that you said, you were behind. I mean, in some ways you were ahead,
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, in a way, we've been working on this for a while, but still, it, as you can see, though, because we have, 7 years on, arguably, we're still trying to figure it out. So it's not an easy, there's no easy fix here. And it requires deliberate investment, and it's not cheap.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Tom Mahler was just on and talking about the downtown Calgary strategy. And I feel like, lots of communities were looking quite longingly at what the municipal staff have, put a line in the sand and said, this is what we're going to do. So it is not cheap. And you're right. And this is part of, I think, our challenge. And I'm assuming you're all going to try to call for this is we need governments to understand that even when the lockdown is lifted, there's still going to be residual effect. And there are all sorts of pre-existing conditions that were just exacerbated through COVID that are still there, and now we're going to have to come to terms with them. Michelle, can I go to you next? In terms of people who are envious, a lot of people are envious of the unique relationship that Montreal has with the province of Quebec, and how you have been able to actually form a bunch of partnerships and do some really ambitious things. Again, pre-COVID, with the city and with different kinds of animation of the. I mean, we all look at the Quartier du Spectacle and just think it's the most fantastic thing. But why don't you talk to us a little bit about what your focus has been and what the Chamber's focus has been in Quebec, in Montreal, and your thoughts, and then I'll carry on with the other two, and then we'll have a collective conversation. Over to you, Michelle.
Okay. Well, clearly, and to link with what Deborah said, I don't know if we were ahead or lacking with the other cities, but we had decades of tough time. And the last 10 years were good for Montreal. So we were on a momentum when the pandemic hit. Montreal downtown was doing very well, lots of towers being built, occupation rate was getting higher. So it was very positive. Pandemics hit, we took a few months, and then we launched an initiative which was called Relaunch Montreal, supported by the federal government and the provincial government. And what we wanted to do at the time was to look at each economic sector with the belief that the dynamics would be very different. Obviously, if you're the airlines industry, the tourism industry versus the IT industry, clearly the pandemics was having different impacts. And at the time, we decided we would treat the downtown as an economic sector of itself. And we kind of disciplined Quebec government and everyone to say, okay, let's look at the downtown as an economic sector. So if you're going to focus on aerospace or life science sector, you have to have a policy, a strategy for the downtown. And with the Quebec government, we were very successful. Clearly, the minister understood right away. So in March last year, the government of Quebec agreed to have a downtown strategy, committed 25 million to that strategy. Of that money, the chamber received $8.5 million to launch a series of initiatives, and I can get into the details if you want. But clearly it was to mobilize everyone, the employers, the building owners, everyone to say, okay, what should we do to bring back the worker? And when we launched it, the number of workers coming downtown was below 10%. And over the summer, up to November, we were raising back to 61% coming back to the workplace downtown, obviously with hybrid model, not all the time. It was having a positive impact on of course, retail stores. Plus, in the fall, we had the students coming back, the university students, CEGEP students, also foreign students coming back, 100,000 of them. So that had a positive impact. Then comes Omicron, shuts everything down. We're back to below 10%, probably around 5% of presence of worker downtown. We are right now in the midst of planning all the steps that we will undergo in the spring And we have money to do that. We have the 8.5 million I mentioned, and we're discussing with the provincial government for a phase 2, a multi-million-dollar phase 2. Now, what's lacking, and we'll come back to that, is federal support for the downtown. Of course, the federal approach has been to have all these aid measures and then to look at sectors, the traditional sectors. So they will reply that we're helping restaurants or we're helping the tourist sector. But I want to have the federal government involved with a downtown strategy all across Canada, also for Montreal. We can come back on that if you want.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I mean, again, I think just to signal to people, there are many people in the chat who are contributing here, and I just want to reemphasize that, you know, we'll continue to be in conversation with everybody about these topics. And I think this is important that we create these networks and sustain them, just as you were suggesting, Michelle, that it has to be a collaboration. And the question is going to be, well, what is the role of the federal government? And that's what I'm going to come back and ask you each about. But just to reassure people, we're not losing anybody's phone number, and there are other ways for us to continue to be in communication with one another, including this Canada Global Cities Council. So maybe, Patrick, you could speak to that. Tell us about your experience looking at, I can see your lovely view behind you in Halifax, and also the CGCC, if you want to just speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely, Mary. And it's actually kind of nice to see cars running behind me. Not as many cars as there should be, obviously. But it's great to be able to join you, and really enjoying the sessions that you've been putting on yesterday and today. Just to give you a little bit of background, like all Canadian provinces and major cities, both in Canada and around the world, the pandemic's had a tough effect, very, very grave effect on our business community. And I do hate to have benefited a little bit from the misfortunes of some of my colleagues, but last year Halifax was actually the second fastest growing city in Halifax. So we've had some of that movement. In fact, as I look at Jan, on my neighbors on each side of me have both recently arrived from Toronto. So not good for Jan, not good for Toronto, but obviously good for Halifax. And while Halifax was envied, Nova Scotia was envied for its COVID response, with some of the strictest COVID restrictions in the country, it's been very tough. 90% of businesses are still reporting lower sales. 80% of hotels have desperate numbers. Business travelers, which was over 500,000 room nights, nothing compared to, again, Toronto, Montreal, or likely even Vancouver, but 500,000 room nights in Halifax is a lot of room nights that simply disappeared in March of 2020. I want to jump in, rather than jumping, I guess, and telling you a little bit more about Halifax, talk a little bit about the CGCC. And although perhaps I'm the current chair, Michelle and I are transitioning now. So Michelle is about to become the chair, and Jan is the previous chair. And in fact, if we go back, Calgary had the chairmanship a long time ago. So a few years ago, not that long. So the CGCC are the 9 largest chambers of commerce and boards of trade across the country. We gathered together to advocate for cities, to talk about what cities should do and how cities are the economic engine of our country in Canada. You know, greater than 50% of the GDP, greater than 50% of the population are in the 9 cities that are in the CGCC. And although there is a rural caucus in Parliament, there is no urban caucus in Parliament to advocate for cities. So we felt that getting together, working together, and speaking to our friends in the federal government, particularly, could really help us to move forward. I want to talk about one other thing that we've done in Halifax, and that is we've been very proactive from the start, creating a group that we called the Nova Scotia Business Labour Economic Coalition. It gathered leaders from business improvement districts, all sectors and industries, government policymakers, to ensure quick and relevant changes to policies, introduce provincial programs and supports, and provide a common space for the exchange of issues, information, and feedback. And Mayor Savage alluded to that when he was speaking. He mentioned the 11 o'clock meeting he was attending, and that was what we affectionately call NS Bleck. Today was our 129th meeting, and I'm really getting tired of it. I'd like to, we'd like to get out of this. We'd like to move forward. And I think to speak specifically about some of the things that are needed, the federal government needs to continue the activation of downtowns. It needs to be targeted to groups like chambers or support from the BIDs, the business improvement districts, who can immediately make Halifax and other downtown cores an attractive and easy place for people to visit. And most importantly, I suppose, they need to help revive that 500,000 room nights that we're missing in Halifax from business travel, and really help support tourism across the country. I'm traveling. I expect to travel to every one of the cities that you see on the screen today, and I really hope that that others will start to travel to some of these cities as well.
It's very hopeful of you, Patrick. I appreciate that. I think that, you know, one of the reasons that we want to talk with you folks, and Jan, you're next, is that just to talk, you know, is to talk about the unique role that business can play. It's maybe not as prevalent in our Canadian tradition, but those of us that have worked in the United States are more familiar with how, and certainly the recovery efforts in the US, business is a very, very prominent voice at the regional level in many of what they call metros, what they call, you know, and they're expected to play that role, and they do. So interesting for me to hear from you folks the efforts that you're trying to make to do that, and whether Canada's ready to understand that you could do that. Jan, the Toronto Region Board of Trade has done a lot of this sort of stepping into domains that people might not have expected the business community to come into, and there you are leading some processes. So do you want to comment a little bit about what you're experiencing in Toronto, what the priorities are for you for the region?
Sure. Thanks, Mary. Bonjour tout le monde. I'm delighted to be here. I know Goldie Hyder off the top was warning us to be careful about this work from home phenomena being a North American thing and not losing sight of the fact that we compete with Asia and Europe. And that's been very much what's been driving us throughout the pandemic. We've been paying very, very close attention to what's happening as global best practices. So let me just share some of our lessons. And as we navigate the fifth wave of the pandemic in Toronto, I think the key message I want to share is that reopening is simply not an on-off switch. Our recovery is not possible if recurring temporary lockdowns are the only approach being deployed by governments. Downtown Toronto is Canada's largest employment zone. We share a lot of the same pain points that Deborah mentioned from Calgary. Pre-pandemic, 550,000 workers commuted daily and were the customers of more than 17,000 small businesses in our downtown. The first lockdown saw 85% of these workers transition to working remotely, and that triggered a 77% drop in spending at those small businesses. And despite various reopening plans since then, a very small percentage of those workers have been back to our downtown in the past 2 years of the pandemic. Our board's Economic Blueprint Institute is tracking return to office. By January 2021, only 5% of workers had returned to downtown offices. By November 2021, that number had grown from 5% to only 31%. And then, as we all know, we went into yet another temporary lockdown. Our downtown small businesses are bearing the brunt of a stop, start, stop policy mindset on business activities and government stimulus. Our businesses are amassing hundreds of thousands of dollars of repayable debt because, as our data proves, reopening simply is not an on switch for them. So 2 years in, we need to start treating the pandemic as a continuing condition and applying best practices globally around sustainable mitigation and not just turning to temporary lockdowns. So what we've been doing in Toronto is a continuation of efforts we've put in place over the past 18 months. It's pushing for the adoption of sustainable mitigations. There are 4 that we've been calling on since the first wave hit us. Speaking to federal and provincial governments about the need for sustainable backstop funding for our public transit systems. We have stood up a program with our financial district, BIA, Mayor Tory, large employers and building owners to put coordinated programming and communications in place to rebuild worker confidence in public transit, returning to the office and returning to our downtown merchants. That needs to continue, and that needs to be funded on a bigger scale. Michelle, I might be giving you a call for some assistance in that regard. You were so successful. And finally, not to lose sight of the fact that all the problems we had pre-pandemic, about housing affordability, homelessness. Those issues are still major issues that need to be tackled as we're thinking about recovery. So that's just a look at how we're experiencing this in Toronto and some of the things that we're pushing forward on. Really look forward to the rest of this discussion, Mary, and sharing with my colleagues on the Canadian Global Cities Council about the things we can be doing together to really make a difference as we move forward.
Thank you. And you know, in the old days, we thought that business just cared about business, you know? Like we just thought you were out there running around figuring out how to print money. And I don't know if I'm of a particular generation. I don't know if there was an expectation that you would actually be a leading stakeholder voice about the quality of the built environment or the quality of life. And I think making that shift, you know, we've gone through this extraordinary period of time where public health has been the dominant narrative. It's hard to imagine anything good to say about a possible war in Europe. But I will say that it seems to be the only thing that pushed COVID off the front page was the fact that we had troops, we have forces lining up on the border, you know? And I remember thinking, wow, we've had public health be the only narrative really for almost 2 years. And I'm interested in how much responsibility the business community could take for that, to say there's actually a variety of voices, because I feel for the mayors and I feel obviously for the provincial leaders as well, who have felt that their priority needs to be keeping people safe and healthy. And it's hard to argue with that, right? But I wonder if we haven't had as sophisticated a narrative to be able to say there might have been a different way to do it, because the result is this extraordinary polarization we have now, where some people think it was that we've gone too far and other people think we didn't go far enough, you know? So from your perspective, in terms of bringing business leadership into this, Deborah, you've had a lot longer in Calgary. We'll have to just keep saying that. You've had a lot longer.
Yep.
You know, you've had to balance the oil and gas sector
Yep.
with calls to have a more diverse economy, for instance, and
Yep.
also calls for a cleaner economy.
Yep.
And you're finding a way to navigate all those voices. Is there something we can learn from you about how to have this conversation, as Jan's suggesting, going forward? Because behind COVID will be something else, right?
Yeah.
And we are obviously not sustainable to just go into lockdowns. That isn't going to be the way of the future. So, Deborah, what's your insight in terms of how you've done it over 8 years, 9 years?
Well, I think we're still on that journey, right?
Yeah.
And that's the challenge. So what we've done has been very deliberate in terms of from a pivot standpoint, from an economic standpoint, we've been very deliberate in terms of how we are attracting business and diversifying the economy. And we've had a record year in Alberta for attracting venture capital. We just announced, the University of Calgary announced this morning that there's going to be a $25 million investment in brain health by the Israeli Foundation. So we're really starting to move forward from that diversification piece, but it has been it's man-to-man defense, it's base hits, there's not one silver bullet. Truly, I love sports, but it's really been a lot of hard work on the part of the Calgary Economic Development, the Chamber, working with the city and making sure that, and then creating a fund called the Opportunity Calgary Investment Fund to actually help attract companies to come and set up their offices in Calgary. So that has
it's been a partnership. And this fund is funded by the government and by
it's a city fund.
City funded.
It's the Opportunity Calgary Investment Fund, and it has brought in accelerators like Thrive, which is an ag tech accelerator. It has helped companies consolidate space in Calgary. It has made some very strategic investments to set up programs with a company called Alta ML to teach machine learning, to help upgrade, reskill and upskill. So there's been a number of different approaches to where they've deployed capital, and they're still continuing to do that. It's been very, very, very successful, and certainly one of the things that we've been very pleased with how it's supported the diversification efforts.
Well, just this is the Calgary show today. Here it's at the Canadian Urban Institute, because every session people have been talking about look at Calgary, because you also have done some very interesting things on mental health. And I think this is the interesting thing, is it can't just be one thing, which is part of what Jan was suggesting with the Blueprint Institute. You have to look at a whole bunch of things. Michelle, you have a unique relationship, obviously, with the government of Quebec. Do you have particular insights about how you've been able to build this cross-sectoral effort based in Montreal, but with different partners. Have you got thoughts on how that's worked well?
Clearly, the first word, and I think today it's meaningful, was mobilization. Okay, when we spoke with the provincial government, we said, okay, now every business in town will be looking at its own solution for its own issues, whether it's bringing back the employees, finding the customers, going international. And we said we need to share the best practices as one business will start its deployment strategy or bringing back the employees. And the leader of the business community were extremely available. Whenever I called, they would return the call immediately saying, okay, I want to do my share for the downtown. So the provincial government understood clearly that if we can harness the energy of the business sector, things will fall back into place. So that was the first message. We need to mobilize the private sector. And secondly, we will need to speak to the employee themselves, and not each company speaking to its own employees, but globally, because we want their family to feel comfortable if they come back to the downtown. We will want them to feel comfortable to get back into the public transit system. We will want them eventually to realize that coming back to downtown might be a bit different than before. So we told the provincial government, help us stimulate the creation of new projects that would be in the private zones, not on the streets, but clearly in the lobbies of big towers, in the underground system. And the idea was to say to the worker, if you come back, you will feel something different. You will find something different. And I will say lastly, we thought about, okay, what will be changed forever with the downtown? And one thing that came and people agreed to is it will be less about neckties and more about running shoes. We will have a downtown with more startups, younger crowd that thought downtown is not for me. It's too corporate or it's too expensive.
Oh, that's interesting.
And with the availability of space, we told the government, we will try and put oil in the system so that it will be very easy for small startups or even businesses in the regions that always thought maybe I should have a foot in the downtown Montreal, but didn't know how or found it too expensive. How can we make sure that the downtown after the pandemic is a new gathering place for a new type of customers? And the provincial government liked that. They said, okay, it's not only about trying to save what can be saved, but it's about projecting in the future the type of downtown we want. And from then on, I guess everybody embarked. And the city also has its own view of what it can do in the public space. And we're working with an organization called Tourisme Montréal, whose goal is to make sure that within Quebec, Quebecers want to come to Montreal and the downtown. Even Montrealers will want to come to the downtown. And eventually, of course, in due time, international mobilization of tourism. So we're working on all axes, and it's about mobilizing. It was also about giving hope, making sure that businesses, small owners would find lights at the end of the tunnel, even if it seemed to be very small, very far away.
Yeah, I can see Patrick just thrilled at the idea that necktie might go by the board there, and you might be into running shoes next, Patrick. But Michelle, in terms of shocks, though, and what Deborah's talking about, I mean, Montreal went through an extraordinary economic shock 40 years ago, right? And I've written about this a bit, and I reflect on it whenever I'm there, that even though that caused an extraordinary rupture and a number of Fortune 500 headquarters decamped, what I observe is it created the conditions for a remarkable locally generated economy to grow up, so that as a result, you're more resilient, right? You have...
Yeah, when we look, and we have lots of numbers that I'm not going to give today because we're going to launch publicly that study in 2 weeks, and it was made in December. And we looked into what will be the impact on the number of people coming downtown and the expenses, consumer expenses downtown. And one thing we found was that the current people who live downtown are helping to stabilize the downtown economy through the pandemic. You have the 100,000 students that came back last September. So even though we're lacking the 300,000 daily worker that would come, they're probably around 30,000 worker coming instead of the 300,000, and there's no tourists. it served as a stabilizer for the downtown economy.
Yeah.
Now, mind you, restaurants are suffering incredibly, but at the same time, I heard Deborah earlier saying, we know that the live, work, and play downtown exists in Montreal, and that's a very positive factor.
Yeah, we have some university presidents coming on for a session this afternoon to talk about the role of universities in downtowns. And, you know, the question is, well, if you don't have a university downtown, as Calgary is suggesting it doesn't, then those, maybe the University of Alberta and the University of Calgary need to rethink and say, well, we're going to put a campus into our downtowns. And I think that's part of the institutional response that we would start to invest differently. They can bring their running shoes into downtowns. Deborah, your hand's up. Go ahead.
My hand's up for a reason, because it's exactly right. That's how you sort of create that sustainable downtown vibrancy, by having the post-secondary institutions downtown, which we do not have in size in Calgary. And that is something that we have to figure out how to make that happen. And that there are conversations going on about that. But the piece is, who's going to pay for it?
Right.
And we need to have, I'm very envious that, Michelle's talking about the investments and the support they've had from the provincial government. We need to have that same kind of financial support from the federal government and from the provincial government, to make sure that this happens, because it's an expensive undertaking, but it really does create a sustainable and different downtown, where you have the opportunity to cross-pollinate across disciplines and within the business community, which strengthens the downtown core in a broader context and over the long term.
We know that we have people from Infrastructure Canada on the call listening, and we will continue, of course, to advocate for them, that as they allocate their infrastructure resources, which will be a huge part of, I think, of the post-COVID recovery, can those be targeted in particular kinds of ways? Hard for the federal government to sometimes target that at that local level, but as you suggest, the opportunity exists to do that. Patrick, you've got more universities per capita than any city, as I recall, and more post-sex. Do you see that as part of the sort of organic structure that you want, recovery structure that you're imagining?
Well, I think we certainly see it, and we were very happy that the universities eventually came back. But remember, for almost a year, they were at home. At home could have been they were in Quebec, or they were in Ontario, or wherever those students happened to be. So we were very happy when they came back. But I want to pick up on something Jan said earlier. We're in a health crisis, but we're in an economic crisis, and that's, I think, what many people tend to forget. Is there is a focus on health, and there has been support available for businesses, but I suspect every business would give that money back to get back the last 2 years, particularly in hospitality and tourism and restaurants and entertainment, particularly in our downtown cores.
Do you think we're going to get the workforce back, guys? Jan, your hand's up. Go ahead and offer whatever comment, but in the middle of it, tell me whether you think we're going to get the workforce back.
Well, I wanted to build on what Patrick was saying. Is the health and economic crisis is being enabled by a data crisis. We simply don't have good information to drive these decisions about lockdowns. Tell me it's the small retailer that's only allowing 2 patrons in their stores that needs to be locked down. So shame on us, we've been calling for this since the beginning of the pandemic. Use the tools that we're using to verify proof of immunization to capture robust contact tracing. People are nervous about public transit, but our public transit systems have invested hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on clean ventilation systems and can trace no cases to them. So in comment to all of this discussion, I think we've got among the highest immunization rates in the world, yet we've had the most draconian lockdown situations, and it's building a deeper hole that we're going to have to dig out of to get through recovery. Do I believe people will be coming back? Absolutely. And it's been in ebbs and flows, because our large employers in the early days said everyone's happy at home, but mental health, stress, the whole lack of collaboration, there's a need. It may not be 5 days a week, or I'd argue 7 days a week, which is what some of the businesses in Toronto were operating at, particularly our innovators. But I think there's going to be a mix where you need to get back in person.
Michelle, Patrick, and then Janet. Go ahead, Michelle, or Deborah,
yes.
sorry.
There's a question by Paul McKinnon about the population movement in the Montreal area, because numbers came out recently saying Montreal was losing population. And just to put that in perspective, I think one thing that's happening, of course, is the pandemic and the impression of people that they will live very happily in the wood as opposed to in the downtown. And we'll see if that happens. But there are 2 other elements. One is, we're kind of catching up with the Vancouver, Toronto, and other cities in Canada where our real estate prices are going up. And at this point, there's kind of a shift in certain populations that cannot afford. So that's something we will look into. We are looking into more housing buildings, more housing constructions. The other thing is, of course, the cost of no immigrants or very few immigrants over 2 years. And immigrants tend to stay first in the large metro area and sometimes eventually moving elsewhere. So what we suspect is that over the next year, as the provincial government has said that they will try to catch up the numbers that did not come, we will see an influx of immigrants that is higher than what would be normal. And therefore, probably, if we do things well, we have more housing, we have housing near the downtown, we also have more immigrants, and we can bring back the worker. And mind you, our numbers say that if we bring back with hybrid models, worker 3 days a week, well, those workers, they probably did not go to restaurants 5 days a week. They probably did not shop the 5 days a week. So if they end up going to restaurants when they come to the downtown, if they end up shopping or going to shows in the evening, well, maybe the diminution of expenses downtown will not be that much. And eventually it will be back to normal. So again, we may have a shift in working arrangements, but perhaps a same level of expenditure in the downtowns, at least in Montreal.
Boy, that's going to be interesting. I mean, I'm agreeing with you completely. It's not like you went out for lunch every day, or the restaurants may have been too crowded, so you didn't go out a couple of days. Whereas if you're saying when you come down, it might be special, you will go. That's a very interesting question, Michelle, you're raising. Patrick, and then Deborah.
Yeah, so I believe that people will come back downtown. Workers will come back. We do need to have, some consistent period of time where we don't have variance. But I believe people will come back. The bigger issue for me right now is the labor force in hospitality, in hotels, in tourism. Those people have gone. I hate to say it. Many of them, not all of them. Many of them have gone. And to pick up on Michelle's point, without immigration, we are going to have such a shortage that those folks are telling me now that they may not be able to open 100% even when travel starts again this summer. So if we have hotels that are sadly closed or have, 20% of their floors closed because they don't have the labor to fill those hotels, that's going to be a real problem.
Yeah, and we saw that during these episodic reopenings. The question is, because they just couldn't get staff back. But as you say, the question is this going to be more than chronic? Is this like a fixed state? Okay, Deborah, then Jan.
So just wanted to pick up on what Jan talked about this, how the information piece. There's a great article in the Financial Times today about the need for the economists and the business people to talk to the epidemiologists. We still have tried to solve this in a very siloed manner. And I think what we really have to do is do more of that cross-pollination and that exchange of ideas so people understand the language of science and the scientists understand the language of business. And I don't think that's really come together the way we've needed it to in order to address where we need to go and how to best mitigate the situation. Secondly, about people coming downtown, it's interesting. There's a bit of a paradox. If you come to restaurants and some bars downtown Calgary, they're pretty full, but people are not working downtown. So that tells me people want to be together. And I think when you're looking at it from a corporate standpoint, people will come back downtown because they realize that it's important for their careers. It's important for their mental health. We have families and we have work families, but we also need to connect. And from a company perspective, an organizational perspective, this is the way you build your corporate brand. This is the way you sustain your corporate brand. This is how you build your business. That culture is critical, and people are fine. Those threads are fraying as people continue to stay and work at home and not have those serendipitous exchanges either in the hallway or wherever they are in the elevator. It's absolutely critical for businesses to be downtown or to be back in the office. What that looks like, hopefully it's a bit more of a varied population, but we do need to see that return because it'll affect businesses, it'll affect their valuations, it'll affect how they do business going forward.
Businesses may need to get pretty creative though about how it initially gets people back because habits form and people are kind of averse to whatever. So it was one of the suggestions yesterday, for instance, is our businesses going to find themselves just to get their workforces back, offering transit passes so that you actually underwrite the cost of your worker to get themselves into the office. There's an idea to throw out. Jan, and then Michelle. You're muted, Jan.
Just trying to get it off here. I was going to say I want to talk quickly to this from two perspectives, two different business districts. Our downtown district, we've been at the table since October 2020 with Mayor Tory, large employers, about how do we get the workers back. We were standing up a campaign. It's called We're Ready Toronto. And every time we were ready to go big with it, this is Leslie in chat, you're asking about placemaking activities. This was intended to be just that. And the latest start date was supposed to be January until the latest lockdowns. But let me tell you, the large employers are all over this. It's not transit passes, Mary. It's if you're in the work or if you're working from the office, we're going to offer you restaurant vouchers to go to local restaurants in the downtown core. We're not going to pay for that if you're working from home, but if you're downtown and if you're going to do a team meeting there's some other incentives. So there was a lot of things that were about making it attractive for people to get back into the office, but then also helping the
local businesses. Yeah, because I used to drive me crazy that Google was before time. You know, you'd go to a meeting in Google in San Francisco and they'd have all the food and the people would never leave the office. And you think, well, you're doing nothing for the local businesses.
Our employers were unapologetically saying, if you work from home, that's your choice. But if you're in the office, you get these perks, and it's going to help businesses in the downtown. Flip side, another business district, Pearson Logistics Zone. It's where e-commerce central is happening. It's Amazon, Canada Post, second largest employment zone in the country, 300,000 workers in that area. More than half of them make less than $40,000 a year. And all of them have to take private transit to get into their jobs. So there's a lot of work going on there. This was Adriana, your question about how employers are responding to calls. A ton of work that we're convening right now to look at how do they make it easier for those workers to get connected to their jobs. Do we need to look at some kind of transit shuttle service, not waiting for public transit, but worker shuttle, where you can take workers that live in the same residential areas and get them into the zone, even though they don't all work at the same company. So a lot of really good discussions happening because businesses recognize they need to create the incentives for workers to come back and support the downtown businesses. And they also needed to make it easier for some of these more discriminated members of the workforce to find it easier to be connected to jobs.
And of course, the question would be maybe to find a way to pay them better than $40,000. So they actually have.
No, I guess, but I mean, you got the practical reality of, you know, Amazon, Walmart, how much is the customer going to want to pay? At a certain point, there's that. So anyway, story for another day.
Yeah, of course. Michelle.
Yes, I wanted to add one of the angles that we're trying to look into, which is how do we achieve a green relaunch for the downtown?
Right.
I think that when we speak to our economic base, we see that the new generation is all about greening not only the businesses, but greening the downtown, which means also, first, what is the place of cars in the downtown? But eventually, it's also about how do you use the public space downtown? A desire to work outside. Now, it may sound weird in Canada when it's -30, but still, we used to have downtowns where you work in your office and you never go outside to work in the summer. So we're going to look into how can we change, I said earlier, more running shoes, less neckties in the downtown, but also a downtown that is part of the energy transition in Canada, and making sure that if you work downtown, you have an impression that, and it's a reality, that it's good for the environment, because proximity might mean that in many ways you're more efficient, you have more services that are available for a larger group of people. So it's also making sure that downtowns are perceived as good for the economy, but good for the environment as well.
Yeah, I mean, we periodically we see surfacing in the chat people to say, well, maybe we shouldn't just be focusing on downtown. Maybe it's good that everybody is distributed across other sites. But then as you suggest, people then come back and say, but wait a second, denser living, more people living downtown, less commute. So probably last word to you, Deborah, because I think we're going to have to wrap. Oh, sorry. And then Patrick with the necktie gets in for the wind. Okay, Deborah, first you, then Patrick.
So just wanted to point out, Calgary City Council has declared a climate emergency, and we're looking very, very closely at how we make sure that we green the downtown. Our LRT system already runs on green power, so on wind power. So it's, we're moving in that direction. But Michelle's absolutely right. The next generation is not as committed to the car culture as the previous generation. And we actually have condos downtown in the East Village that were built without parkades, because we know that people will not be looking to have that. It's not something that they value the way their parents did. And so we have to be very mindful of that. But the other piece is, in Calgary, we're particularly challenged in terms of having the services downtown to support people living and working downtown in a broader context. There's services to support you if you're there for the day, you want to grab something to eat, that's fine. But from a broader context, we're still lacking a lot of services. And that's the other piece that has to happen in order to make that neighborhood a reality.
Patrick.
Just wanted to say, although I'm wearing a tie, I'm wearing jeans, in the and sneakers in the office. Okay, just wanted to say.
You're a hybrid. You're a good hybrid example of hybrid worker. Well, listen, gang, thank you very much for joining us. I think that, there's more to this story, right? There's more. There were questions in the chat about what about a universal basic income. We just started to talk a little bit about how do you do economic diversification? How do you do it greening? We have sessions this afternoon talking about the role of culture and cultural amenities for both locals and for the tourist economy. I know that business tourism is part of a large part of your constituency, are concerned about conventions and the future of business travel and all that thing. So the conversation will continue. I'm so appreciative of you taking the time, and also to continue to look to the Canadian Global Cities Council for the leadership that business can provide in matching, so that we don't matching the intensity of the public sector on this, so that, Jan, we don't have that kind of, you're for lockdowns, we aren't kind of dynamic, but that we're actually all in this together somehow, agreeing which of the multiple emergencies, a pandemic, a climate emergency, an economic emergency, an equity emergency, how do we collectively embrace that? So I appreciate all the leadership that you're doing in each of your cities and that you're doing with the council across the country. Michelle, lovely to see you, because as I told you, lots of people look to Montreal as having done a lot of the right things. And Deborah, I used to call Calgary the prophetic city. I still will, because you've been at it for so much longer. And so we appreciate learning from you, and always great to have the GTHA here in the capacity that you represent it, Jan. And Patrick, glad to see you in your running shoes next time. And we're now going to take a break for I think 13 minutes or so, and we're going to come back and we're going to talk specifically with the International Downtown Association, who are going to have a variety of perspectives that Ken Kelly has convened on what they're calling street issues, all of which are relevant to what our previous panel just talked about. So thanks very much for joining us. Really great for you to be on with us.